This morning I'm going to give a part one of a two-part talk on what we usually call the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra has been written about and discussed extensively. There are whole books on the subject. Red Pine, if you really want to go deeply into the meaning of the Heart Sutra, is a good place to start. So, given the time that I have, I'm going to give, obviously a very limited description or discussion of the Heart Sutra. On the other hand, I hope to demystify it. It's easy to read this and think that it's very mysterious. But like all Buddhist teachings, it's actually not mysterious. It has directly to do with our lives. It has to do with how we exist, how we feel, how we think, and so on and so forth. It's not a mystery. Now, I think part of the mystery lies in the simple name we give it, the Heart Sutra. It is more properly and anciently called the Mahaprajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra. That's in Sanskrit. The composition for this began at about 100 BCE. This was shortly about 300 years after the Buddha's death. It's also translated in English as the Great Heart of Perfect or Transcendent Wisdom Sutra, or the Great Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom. This short version that we chant is part derived from the 8,000 line composition, which I'm going to be reading from in a moment. Now, I don't know about you, but I've repeated the Heart Sutra, I don't know how many times, over 50 years, but an awful lot. And an awful lot of that time, I had no idea what I was chanting about. I don't know about you. Maybe you have more intellectual capacity than I have. But it does, as I said before, have a very solid meaning. Now, the Heart Sutra begins, when the Bodhisattva of compassion saw the emptiness of all five skandhas, he sundered the bonds that caused him suffering. Well, this should alert you right away to something a little odd about this translation. Avalokiteshvara was never a living person. Avalokiteshvara is one of the great 8 bodhisattvas, most prominent of whom are the Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, Samantrabhadra, who's the bodhisattva of practice, and Maitreya, the future Buddha. All these Buddhas are actually you. They're contained within the human mind. They're not something floating out in space somewhere. So when we hear the Avalokiteshvara sundered the bonds and caused him suffering, that's really a very strange idea, because we're talking about a mind state or a behavior or a way of being. We're not talking about an actual human being who could do something. An abstraction cannot take action on other abstractions. So, in order to clarify this, I'm going to read from the 8,000 line translation of the Heart Sutra. It was done by Edward Conzi. He translated the Heart Sutra as the heart of the transcendent perfection of wisdom. It's well to remember that Manjushri, when we're talking about transcendent wisdom, Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, he carries a sword. It symbolizes active wisdom, wisdom as action. If you stop to think about it, just thinking wise thoughts doesn't change anything. In order for wisdom to exist, it must become action. So that's another clue to the transcendent perfection of wisdom. What kind of actions are we looking at? Okay, he goes on to say, homage to the perfection of wisdom is the first line. Blessed Mother. Well, this gives us a clue. The perfection of wisdom, Blessed Mother. Zazen is the Blessed Mother. Zazen is essentially a receptive practice. You know, in Chinese philosophy, you read about yin and yang, yin being the female and yang being the male. It should be reminded that yang has a little bit of female inside. If you were purely aggressive, you'd be walking into walls. And yin has a little bit of male inside, because if you were purely passive, then you'd kind of crumple down to the floor. You gotta have some active impulse to keep you awake. So Zazen and this practice is receptive. Remember that. Thus did I hear at one time. The Blessed One, that's the Buddha, was residing on Vulture Peak Mountain in the Rajagraha at Rajagraha, together with the great Sangha of monks and a great Sangha of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Blessed One rested in an absorption on the categories of phenomena called illumination of the profound. Now here we get our first clue as to where this sutra is coming from. It's coming from the Blessed One, the Buddha, in this case, the person in the state of enlightened state. The Blessed One in it rested in an absorption on the categories of phenomena called the illumination of the profound. At that time, the Bodhisattva Great Being, Noble Avalokiteshvara, while practicing the profound perfection of wisdom, looked and saw that the five aggregates are also empty of intrinsic nature. Now, we're going to talk today primarily about the five aggregates. Now, note, we've already got the Buddha or the Blessed One in a profound state of illumination. And what is the illumination? The illumination is around compassion, the function, how compassion functions. So we have Avalokiteshvara. Then, due to the Buddha's power, Venerable Sariputra asked the Bodhisattva Great Being, Noble Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha manifesting compassion, how should the sons of noble families or daughters of noble family train if they wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? By the way, we are all noble family. That's part of the Buddhist tradition. The Bodhisattva of Great Being, Noble Avalokiteshvara, replied to Venerable Sariputra, Sariputra, sons of noble families or daughters of noble, who wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, should see things in this way. They should correctly observe the five aggregates to be empty of intrinsic nature. Again, we'll be discussing just the five aggregates today. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. And form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feelings, perceptions, formations, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, therefore, all phenomena are emptiness. They are without characteristic, unborn, without stains, without absence of stains, not deficient and not complete. Sariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feelings, no perceptions, no formations, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no texture, and no mental object. No mental object means something you think about. There is no element of the I, up to no element of the mind, and further up to no element of mind consciousness. This seems to erase Buddhism itself. There is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance, up to and no aging and death, and no exhaustion of aging and death. There's no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, no wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Hey, We're told the Buddhism is about relieving suffering, and we're just told it doesn't exist. Sariputra, therefore, since bodhisattvas have no attainment, they rely upon and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, because their minds have no veils. Veils are obstacles, habitual modes of thought, habitual modes of action, habitual emotional responses. Have no veils, and they have no fear. Having utterly gone beyond error, they reach the culmination of nirvana. All the Buddhas who reside in the three times have likewise fully awakened to unsurpassed and perfect awakening by relying upon the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra that is equal to the unequal, the mantra that is utterly pacifies all suffering. Then we're back to suffering, which earlier we were told didn't exist. Interesting, isn't it? Since it is not false, it should be known to be true. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom stated thus: Gatte, gatte, paragatte, parasamgatte, bodhisattva. Sariputra, in this way, a bodhisattva, a great being, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom. We're all bodhisattvas, a great being, in practice. You know, I always love the fact that Suzuki Roshi, and you've probably all heard this before, but it bears repeating, when asked what is the nature of human beings, he said, oh, human beings are perfect in their own being. But there's always room for improvement. Then the Blessed One arose from that absorption. We're back to the Buddha, being the person whose these words are, and gave his approval to the Bodhisattva, great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, saying, excellent, excellent, son of noble family. It is like that, son of noble family. It is like that. The profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced just as you have taught. Even the thus gone one will rejoice. That would be the Buddha. When the Blessed One had said this, Venerable Sarvadatta, the Bodhisattva great being, noble Avalokiteshvara, and the entire family, entire assembly, as well as the world with its devas, humans, asuras, Gandharvas, rejoiced and praised that the Blessed One had said. This completes the great vehicle sutra, the heart of the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Now, I read that, what we just chanted, I think it brings a little bit more light into the basic nature, takes away that paradoxical situation which we chant, in which we have a mind state as actually acting to sever the five skandhas. Okay, as I promised you today, we're going to talk about the skandhas because it's fundamental to understanding this sutra what the skandhas are. Now, if you haven't caught on, this sutra is actually about meditational experience. That's the thing, one thing. This sutra is about what you experience when you're meditating. And as your practice progresses, what you may experience in your daily life as well. But it is not some abstract thing. It is tangible. You are already, whether you label things as such, you are already experiencing much of what this sutra is talking about. Okay, let's look at the skandhas. The first skandha, the first of the skandhas, or rupa, are the 6 sense organs of the body. The eye, the ear, the nose, taste, physical sensation, when you touch, hear, see, whatever, something, that's physical sensation. Thought and ideas. Now, it's a little startling, I think, to Westerners to think of consciousness as a sense. I believe there's good reason to think of it as that. Sensory deprivation experiments were done, and they showed that when the brain is deprived of sensory input, it starts to hallucinate. In other words, the brain depends upon sensory input to function. It is part of the sensory input system. It's always on in one way or another. I don't know how many of you have looked up at clouds and suddenly you see a calf's head or a motorcycle or a dog or something in the clouds. Your brain does much the same thing with all the sensations. It organizes them. In this case, it's looking up the clouds and it's kind of comparing the cloud shape to other shapes it knows about and giving them a meaning. Now we know, of course, the clouds aren't actually cats and motorcycles, but the brain is nevertheless working on that subject. Here are the clouds. This is why I think we can legitimately consider the brain as a sense organ. Now, I know in the West, and I'm sometimes disturbed by it because I think that what they're talking about would be a hell of somehow taking out a person's brain and freezing it for eternity, or putting the consciousness into a computer where it would have no sense inputs whatsoever. Kind of crazy, actually, but we get crazy in the West, like every other part of the world gets crazy in their own particular way. The second skandha is called sensation. In Sanskrit, it's called Vedana. Vedana is the physical or mental sensation that is experienced through the contact of the 6 organs in the world. That is how we perceive things. I'd like to point out something about perception at this point. You know, you go over to smell a rose, and it's a wondrous, complex, stimulating experience. And then you smell sour milk, and it's also a wondrous, complex experience. But what we do through symbolism is we reduce that experience nearly to nothing. The rose smells good, the sour milk smells bad. And this becomes a way of living in the world, and it has nothing to do with the rich complexity of actual experience. And because words can be attached in many different ways, we often too often, let me put it this way, attach labels, particularly good and bad labels, to people and things where it has nothing to do with their real essence. Language in that way can be very deceptive. It's also very valuable, of course. With language, you can say, hey, this rose smells good. Hey, smell it. Here, give your friend a treat. Or you can tell, hey, that milk is bad, don't pour it in the coffee. So language is certainly valuable, but our experience, our sensation is much more complex than language. I think you all basically know that. But so what we're dealing with here is first of all very important to recognize in our meditation what language is. Or rather, how sensation is, complexity of sensation and its relationship to language. The third skandha is perception, called sana. This is the capacity to conceptualize and recognize things through associating them with other things. We recognize this as a cup because we have experience with the previous thing that looked just like this and functioned in a certain way. Like, oh, that's a cup. Sometimes the context in which an object is found allows us to classify it. For example, one might see an odd-looking object in a workshop and thus conclude that the object is a tool. The fourth skandha is mental formation. mental formation, which is the first, by the way, of the nidanas. I'd like someday to talk to you about nidanas. It's on the outer rim of the Wheel of Life, 12 nidanas. We recognize these are the formation of volitional activity or manifested action. So that's the second nidana, or manifested actions, whether appropriate and beneficial, neutral, or harmful. Okay, this is a formation. When let's say we see a car coming down the street. So, we then go to the fourth skandha. What does this mean? This means, in practical terms, I better not step into the street right now. Otherwise, I'll get hit by a car. So we need that particular, this fourth skandha allows us to come to an understanding of a particular situation. Okay? The mental formation not only includes such things as visually noting something that might be dangerous or something that might be attractive. It also, the mental formations are connected to how we think and feel. If we see our neighbor as dangerous or unpleasant, or if we see our neighbor as attractive, regardless of how we see our neighbor, how we see them is going to affect the way that we interact with that person. So that is another of the fourth skandhas, how we feel about certain things. It's interesting, the Buddha wrote this in the Dhammapada. All things have the nature of mind. Mind is the chief and takes the lead. If the mind is clear, whatever you do or say will bring happiness that will follow you like a shadow. So if you see the neighbor as the neighbor and treat the neighbor with respect, the kind of respect that person is worthy of or should receive, you'll be happier in your relationship with the neighbor. All things, second, these are the twin verses. All things have the nature of mind. Mind is the chief and takes the lead. If the mind is polluted, whatever you say leads to suffering, which will follow you as a cart trails a horse. So that's the power of the fourth skandha, where we form what kind of actions we're going to take. Now, the fifth skandha, as I said, is consciousness. Consciousness is what puts it all together, and its object is the other sensory inputs of the body. It's easy to understand. Let's take vision. Well, we have cones in our eyes which promote color vision, but as I think you know, vision is not a solid thing. It requires light, something for the light to reflect off, a functioning eye, and then that goes into the brain, and it is actually the brain's arrangement of the information from the cones in our eye that provides color vision. Another example of why the brain could be considered as a sense organ. It kind of provides the information necessary to put it all together. In conclusion, we should understand that consciousness does not exist independently from the other skandhas. It rather exists in awareness, or the function of the other skandhas. It's just repeating what I just said. It's part of a system of perception. And going back to my comment about the sensory deprivation experience, when the brain is deprived of sensory input, it starts to hallucinate. So the idea is an independent thing is a quite mistaken and dangerous idea. Once you understand the skandhas, you'll start to understand that you are not the skandhas. They are temporary, conditioned phenomena. They are empty of a soul or permanent essence of self. As Buddhists, we teach anatta. They arise and fall away in the process Buddhism refers to as dependent arising, meaning that a particular set of conditions must be present for a particular form to arise. Dependent arising is a unique, so far as I know, Buddhist concept, and an extremely important one, and I'll be discussing that in the part 2 next week, its significance in regards to understanding the Heart Sutra. Thank you.